Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined in this episode by author Menna van Praag. Her new novel is The SISTERS GRIMM, a dark and evocative tale of four seemingly unrelated young women united by a surreal supernatural origin. Goldie, Liyanna, Scarlet, and Bee are all on the cusp of 18, each burdened by complicated family relationships and all filled with a deep sense of longing for something that they can't quite remember. As children, they found each other in Everwhere, an unchanging world outside of their world of magic and perpetual night. Crossing over to Everwhere is a gift only the offspring of a single demonic father possess, but as teenagers, they are torn from each other and forget their shadowy dreamworld. Now, about to come of age, the powers that are their birthright flare into existence again, and the gates to Everwhere reopen to them. Their father's other children prowl there too, though, sons turned soldier, whose all-consuming mission is to kill their father's powerful daughters. Enemies and alliances form as these half-sisters seek to understand who they really are and face a choice to die in the light or join their father's eternal darkness. The SISTERS GRIMM is available now from Harper Voyager, and Menna, welcome to Fictitious.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is a very difficult book to describe.
No kidding.
So as we're recording this on March 31st. And so the book is actually just dropping and arriving today,
Yeah.
Which has got to be super exciting in the time of pandemic and everything is crazy. And you get to have a new book coming out. And then now you get to talk about it all the time. How do you explain this novel?
Oh, gosh, you did very well, by the way. Writing the blurb for this novel was probably the harder than writing the novel. It was very challenging to summarize it. So you did an awesome job. I remember us going through with the publisher, doing the blurb, the back copy, and also me when I was submitting to agents, trying to do a synopsis. I hate synopses. I think they're the worst thing ever. I mean, how do you summarize a book? Because if a book's a good book, it just is impossible to shrink down to 3 paragraphs. And when I'm talking about things that I've written, I'm normally talking about them thematically rather than what actually happens. I'm always like, it's a story about self-realization and empowerment and independence. Oh, what happens? Oh, yeah, well, and then I trail off.
Well, it's a challenging thing to figure out if you're going to talk to people about plot, if you're going to talk to them about character, or if you're going to talk to them about theme. Because while all those things are interwoven in a story, they're also independent things upon themselves, to consider and to discuss. And then trying to figure out how to be pithy about that and deliver it in a short, concise manner. I mean, I do it at the beginning of every one of these episodes, but I have the benefit of being completely separated from the process ahead of time. So I can just read a chunk of the story and go, okay, this is how I would try to explain it to somebody else. But when you have the entirety of that world in your head, you know those characters really well, and you know how complex the plot is. And beyond, you know what's even more than's on the page. You know all the stuff that went into it. So yeah, that is a singular job that I feel like should never fall to the author, because there's no good way for you to actually do it. Unless you've somehow managed that super high concept of, I can explain it in 3 sentences, which happens occasionally. And that's very admirable, but I don't know how anybody does it.
No, like the elevator pitch. I started writing screenplays in my 20s, and we always had to summarize everything, in this elevator pitch. And I once went on a screenwriting festival, and we actually had to get into an elevator with the producer and do it. And I was like totally tongue-tied. And she said, "So what's it about? Oh, and what genre?" It was just dreadful. I was dreadful. I would not be good in marketing.
Well, and then, of course, the elevator pitch now always seems to be like, it's this plus this equals this.
Yeah.
You have to compare it to a couple of different properties that already exist and then hope that that makes sense to somebody. And I see that so often in novels now that have kind of adopted that same thing. They're like, well, if you love Game of Thrones, but you need it with this thing. And almost never does the book actually seem anything like those things combined. But it's just enough to grab an audience and go, oh, well, I kind of like that other thing that I've seen. Maybe I'll like this other thing. I don't know. I feel like sometimes that kind of marketing falls flat for me. But, the publicists and the marketers know better than I do. I am a lowly podcaster who just talks about how the books get made. Menna, you mentioned before we even got started on the proper interview that this is your first real book of fantasy. You've done that feels like the wrong terminology, but you've done magical realism before this. I would say that this book it's kind of on the line between magical realism and fantasy. It definitely has kind of elements of both. Talk to me like where this book started at for you. What was like the conception of it, and what brought you over from the magical realism space into a more proper fantasy?
Yeah, so I've written 5 books, magical realism, and I always wanted to write fantasy because I grew up with Narnia and Alice in Wonderland, and I used to sit in wardrobes, and, I still like to go into wardrobes, just check, always worth checking just in case. But I never had either the time or the courage to do it. And, that was a huge leap for me, because writing something that's set in our world but just has a bit of magic in it seemed quite easy to me. I mean, that's how my brain works anyway. I think, well, we're just in this cafe, and then what if these cakes that we're eating have magical properties and we all start falling in love with each other, or whatever it is. That's not a great leap to me, but having a whole nother world is something quite extraordinary.
And some of those things you're talking about there, that sense of there is a cafe in this one. I wouldn't say that there's magical cakes per se, but there's a magical person making them. But now you're adding an extra layer of this place called Everwhere, which is a through the wardrobe secondary world. So where did this idea germinate from? How was it building in your mind? How did it change over time?
Well, it started off small and manageable. And I think if I'd have known how it was going to go, I probably would never have gone there. It began as a magical realism story. I mean, I had the concept of Everwhere. I had this idea about the gates. It all started there. It was like my homage to Narnia, the whole thing of you're stepping through a wardrobe. And so I live in this beautiful city called Cambridge, and we have all these colleges, and they've been built sort of hundreds of years ago. We had our 900th year anniversary quite recently. To Americans, that's like, what? It's really
right. Yeah. We're like, something's like 80 years old, and we're like, it's ancient. Yeah.
I know, it's so funny. And I went to Oxford, so I know it from both sides. And when you're in it, you feel as though you're in another world because you're just encapsulated in this bubble, and you can really kind of live in this medieval environment. And then you go outside and you're like, oh, I'm actually in the real world. And I thought Alice in Wonderland was written by a Don at Oxford. Lord of the Rings, equally. It doesn't surprise me that these fantasy worlds come out of this environment because it is very magical. And I thought in Cambridge, there are so many places I can't go because there are gates and they're locked and they say the master's garden, and there's no one's allowed in them. And it just occurred to me at one point, I was like, well, what if you could go in these gates? What if you had a special power that meant that when you open those gates at a certain time in the middle of the night, that you went not into the master's garden, but into Everwhere? This started, and when I started to write the book, I was thinking about all the fairy tale sisters. I didn't actually define this place. It was just nebulous. It was just a place that they went and then they came back. And then I was doing very early drafts and I was giving it to early readers, and they're like, yeah, but what about this place? What is this place? I need to know more about this place. And it just evolved and evolved and evolved. And then I remember with the last third of the book, one of my very good readers who does early edits of my work, she said, oh, you've got to set the last third in Everwhere. The ultimate confrontation has to happen there. And I was like, no, by this point, we're kind of 4 years in and I'm slowly losing all my hair, weeping continuously because it was becoming this enormous beast that I didn't anticipate. But then I think with a lot of books, if you knew what you were going in for when you started them, you probably would just back the hell away.
Well, certainly once things start passing like the 400 and 500 page count, and there's a lot to keep track of. And now you've got magic systems and complicated mythologies and stuff. Because I think it's worth noting here, too, that Everywhere is this, magical through the looking glass place, but it seems like its origins and how it relates to these girls. And there are the 4, the Sisters Grimm who we're following in this story, but there's quite a number of young women who have this same lineage that gives them access to this place and also puts them in a great deal of danger. They come over to this place, and it seems like, as children, a fun place to play. They suddenly have this sisterhood with each other. They're developing these interesting abilities, and yet their personal origin is very dark, and they have these other sort of star pseudo-siblings who are on the hunt for them as well. So this is some pretty dark stuff. This is certainly not friendly, happy magical realism stuff kind of happening here. You know, there's this fifth character named Leo, who's one of our other POVs in the story, whose entire job in life is to murder these women who have this spark, this power that come from this lineage. And we meet him, and he's quite charming, and he's quite alluring, and his singular mission is murder. And he's always felt pretty good about that. But now we also find him in conflict as well. And we will get around to that. But there was something I thought was interesting in the theme of this story. And it felt like these young women are in a battle for identity, because they're trying to figure out who they are, where their place is in society, where their place is with their families. They've got definitely some complicated family structures going on. And now they've got this whole thing that they have, this hole in their lives that they're missing, and that they're suddenly able to re-examine from a new way. But it raises all these other questions, because there's a big question in wait for them, a big choice coming up for them when they turn 18. Can you kind of talk about that thematically, what's happening in the novel for these four women and what this choice is that lies in wait for them?
When you kind of break it down, it seems really dark and horrible in a way. And I knew I'd alienate a lot of my readers with it, because my other books, my magical realism books, get described as like a hug, you know, like a comforting. And it's true. I knew that this would happen. And I have literally had reviews saying, what is she doing? What has happened to her books? You know, but equally, the new readers are embracing it, which is really cool. But for me, it was always very metaphorical. You know, I know it has a lot of murder, a lot of darkness, but the idea for me was that these women, they're searching for themselves, and they're searching for their own sense of self, and they're searching for their power, really. And as a young woman, I was a massive people pleaser. I never said no to anyone. I let people take advantage of me. And it's taken me, you know, I'm now in my 40s to really be able to say no and to have a sense of my own authority. That's a theme in all my books, but this was particularly in this book, it was very strong. So they, you know, when we meet them and they're nearly 18, they're kind of experiencing that thing that took me then another 20 years to do, but between what they want and what other people want of them. So you have them, you know, each of them has a soldier who's tracking them down and who will try to kill them. You know, they either roll over and die, or they have to stand up and fight. And that to me is hugely metaphorical, especially in women's lives, but in all of our lives, that at some point you have to make a stance and say, this is important to me. This is what matters. This is who I am. So that last third of the book, even though it's incredibly dark in terms of violence, it was so empowering to write. Because when the sisters came to fight their soldiers, I was literally just had to stop typing and get up and shake my hands and pace around the room, You know, they had come to this ultimate point in their life, and it was a yes or a no. And I think so many of us just don't necessarily realize how important these choices are. You know, every time we don't, you know, make a stance for ourselves, every time we let something go, or we just don't assert ourselves, it chips away at us. And this was my, you know, me wanting to say no.
To move from a passive stance to a person of agency.
Absolutely. Perfectly summarized. That's what I was trying to say.
Let's talk about these characters a little bit more directly. So, I mean, we have Goldie and Liyanna and Scarlet and Bee. And Goldie works in a hotel. She's a cleaner. She's also taking care of her younger brother, and she's stealing things she's kind of a thief and a liar, but sort of as a matter of survival, because she doesn't really make a lot of money. And Liyanna is an artist who has come from a certain level of privilege. She's in a relationship she doesn't reveal to her family, and she's got a great deal of talent, but she's not really exerting it necessarily quite to the level that she could. You have Scarlet, who's working in a shop and taking care of an aging grandmother who has Alzheimer's and isn't quite with her. And then you have Bee, who is kind of impulsive and confrontational, and whose mother is a full unbeliever in the joys of evil, and has been preaching to her since she was a young child that she's the one person whose like family member is like, oh, this is what your lineage is. You need to go straight to the dark side. Don't mess around with any of this being good stuff. Just go dark from the beginning, which I think is an interesting perspective. I will throw out there that it was weird for me in reading the novel because, so Liyanna in this novel is kind of like a graphic artist, like she's drawing a comic book or a graphic novel. And I have a friend whose name is Liyanna, who is a comic book artist who does graphic novels. And so I kept having like these weird little like fluctuations of like making my head twitch because I kept envisioning my friend. And I was like, nope, that's not her. It's a different person, totally different perspective. But it's funny how fiction does that sometimes, where like you have that, for me, that just a little bit of resonance where I was like, oh no, I kind of know that person, but I don't. They're not the same, but it's weird.
That's really cool, because one of the things I really wanted to do was to say that these women are all of us, that we're all a Sisters Grimm, that there's amazing potential in every single human being. And whether we realize it or not is one thing, but it's there.
And I feel like I'm going to send this book to her afterwards and be like, hey, just read and see just how it feels. And granted, the name is spelled just slightly differently, but it's still, yeah, it definitely hit me like that. I mean, I talked through kind of who these characters are, but like, can you kind of talk about what motivates each one of them? And I want to talk really particularly about their family relationships, because that matters a lot in this book, because none of them have a proper father figure. There's a crappy stepfather in there for one of them, but because their actual father is of interesting origin and has a different part to play in all this, can you kind of tell me about like each one of them, like what is pushing them through this story and some of those obstacles that they face and what those influences are from their family?
Yeah, so the idea initially for the sisters came from the fact that the brothers Grimm essentially appropriated the stories of, the oral histories of fairy tales, and then wrote them down and claimed ownership of them, and then we think that they wrote them all. And then it occurred to me that essentially then the daughters of the brothers Grimm, their characters would be sisters to each other. And that was how the idea started. Essentially, they're not actually all Sisters Grimm, because they're not all, come from the stories. So Goldilocks isn't, and Beauty and the Beast isn't, but it doesn't really matter. I thought they're all kind of fairy tale characters. And I chose really the ones that appeal to me the most in terms of the stories. So the idea of Goldilocks working in a hotel came from the idea of Goldilocks sleeping in the beds of the bears. And then she becomes a thief, and steals things from the hotel. And I had a lot of fun writing those scenes. Then it developed in terms of their parenting. And I think it was because when I started writing this book, I just had a little girl. I had a boy already, but having your own gender sort of makes you feel differently about yourself and about your legacy and all of that kind of thing. So I was thinking a lot about feminist fairy tales and retellings and talking to her at night. I was also kind of virtually hallucinating because I wasn't sleeping for so long. And I was just like trying to write these stories at 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. And that's why I think you go into Everwhere at 3:30 a.m. in the morning, because I was just like always up at that point. So things took on a dark turn. But essentially, big theme came out about this competing between getting other people's approval and wanting independence from them. So they have this dark father who's essentially abandons them. They don't know he's going to try and reclaim them at 18. They have no idea. So they're growing up without this father. And then their mothers take on different, some of their mothers are overbearing and controlling. Some of their mothers are distant and cruel. Some of their mothers are overbearing and cruel. There's different elements in the mothering. And the daughters respond in different ways. And that was always something that really interested me. When you withhold approval from someone, they really want it. When you give it to them too much, they don't care for it. It's always fascinating to me how we're affected by our parenting and how we then grow up and what problems we then have with relating to other people and how we internalize conflicts, essentially.
There's a flashback scene in it. I think this is with Goldie, where you see her with her mother and her mother is telling her stories. And Goldie has, even as a young child, has this desire to flee. And her mother weaves stories around her that basically manipulate her into a sense of staying. Like basically like I think the line is something like that she wraps like sort of like the apron strings around her tighter and holds her in place. And she uses this sort of bastardized version of Rapunzel to explain why she should never leave. And I remember like reading that part and being like, oh, this is such a master stroke of manipulation on the part of the mother. You know, because you're telling just a story, but it's a story that cements in a child's mind and changes their perspective on things. And should say a lot more about the mother than the child, but the child takes the story and internalizes it, and that changes her whole perspective on things. It really does reflect the challenging relationship between a lot of children and parents and the way a lot of those things can go wrong if they're not handled very well. So yeah, I thought that part was really fascinating. I want to talk about Leo here in a second, but I think it's worth noting that, we're talking about these 4 separate characters. These are all POV characters, but you do some really interesting structural stuff in this book that I don't think that we run across very often, which is, I'm trying to figure out how to sum all this up. So we have the 4 girls, and then we have Leo. The POV follows all 5 of those characters at different points, but Goldie is in a first-person narration. The other 4 are in third-person limited. Occasionally, when we see Everwhere, we get a third-person omniscient narrative explanation of what that space looks like. When we're in the current timeline, we're getting a present tense delivery, but there are flashbacks to all these characters that are in past tense. Menna, you made a lot of work for yourself, and I can't imagine what it was like to try to keep all that stuff straight. So what brought that decision into the storytelling here? And at any point, did your editors come to you and say, maybe we need to have a chat for a little bit and sort out what this decision-making process? And it works. And it took me a little while to even I noticed Goldie right off versus the other ones, but even some of the tenses and stuff, it didn't occur to me until later. What brought you to making those structural choices?
Well, as I was saying before with how it evolved, I did not set out to think, right, I'm going to set myself a massive challenge. Because in all my other books, I always had multiple POVs, so I've never had a problem with that. I love reading that. I love writing that. I think I get bored easily, so I like to switch, between characters and see what's going on with that character, But my goodness, when I brought in flashbacks and third person, second person, first person, moving timelines, moving from this world to that world, it evolved over time, and it did sometimes make me weep over my keyboard when I realized what I'd done to myself and how I then had to make it work. Because when you're restructuring something and you have multiple POVs and you have flashbacks and flash forwards, and it just often doesn't make sense. And I've tried to use other, word processing things. Like I've tried Scrivener and I just couldn't understand it very well. So I'm like on Word doc. I do all this on Word doc, then with kind of note cards, I'm very old fashioned. And I would just sometimes weep and think, why? I can't, understand this. But when I submitted it to an agent and then we worked on it together, because he was very specialist in sci-fi and fantasy. So he knew, his onions, he knew what he was doing with it. And by the time we submitted it to the editor, I think oftentimes now authors work very closely with their agents to edit stuff. By the time we submitted it to the editor, it was pretty polished. And so he didn't say, oh my God, we really need to have a talk. Because we'd done all of the weeping behind the scenes and we'd done all of the hair tearing. I have to say one thing my agent did do, there was another sister. And he was like, no, you need to cut out this. And it was so funny because, sometimes authors are very attached to their characters and they don't want to cut them. So I cut her, but I kept her in as like a ghost. And then he said, you didn't really cut her, did you? She's still there. And so I am grateful, honestly, to him, because I thought, yeah, no, that's way too many characters. Plus they're elemental, they control each of the 4 elements. So he was like, you really need to have 4 of them. So, and then sort of spoiler alert, some of them don't make it. So in the next book and the one after that, there'll be less of them and it will be easier.
That's something to look forward to then. You're like, okay, we're going to like whittle this down as we go along. I'm certain some listeners right now are already shuddering like, wait, hold on. What? We're going to kill some of them off? I mentioned there's all those characters. There's the 4 girls. And you mentioned they're all elemental. I'm going to swing back around to that because the magic part is worth noting as well. But I did mention Leo, who's this other POV character. And Leo was a star that is now a son who is a person living on Earth, raised essentially as a foundling, raised into a young man in a wealthy family who's very aware of his nature. And he's watching Goldie. She is his current prey because he has a long background of murdering other people in these power and bloodlines, but he's becoming intrigued by her, and that's changing his own perspective on what he does. So you can kind of talk about this role, because you said that, there's sort of a hunter for each one of these girls. Leo is our point of view from the other side of the war here. What viewpoint does Leo give us? What does he open up for us as far as the world building and an understanding of this conflict that's going on and the conflict within himself?
Yeah, so I realized at a certain point, the way that I write, I kind of write to discover things. I don't really plot. I don't really see what's going to happen down the line. I write and then I see what is happening by the characters telling me. And I realized at a certain point that Leo was showing us, essentially a war. And how that people wouldn't fight wars, that is, if they're choosing to fight them, if they didn't believe in what they were doing, so they really have to think that the other side is wrong and that they are right. But it really mattered to me that he would believe, he's been told certain things. He's been brainwashed, essentially, to believe a certain point of view. And it's not until he really gets to know Goldie, his prey, that he starts to question his point of view. And essentially, all of the soldiers are really like gladiators. They're not the ones in the position of power unless they keep themselves in that position of power. But their father wants his daughters to kill them. He wants them to fight and he wants the sisters to win because they're more powerful and then they will become dark. Because once you've killed a person, you're dark in a way that you cannot come back from. And I wanted to look at that as well, about how we all make choices all the time and how there is light and dark in all of us. What side we fall onto at any given time could change. Because it always fascinates me with reading characters who are essentially bad, but why are they bad? What happened to them? And there's a big theme about revenge because a sister murdered Leo's best friend and he lost it. And he thought anyway that the sisters are bad and that he's good. And then he goes on this rampage because he's in pain and he wants to get his revenge. And I think revenge is a very human thing, and it's another way in which we make us and them. And we don't realize, embrace the thing of we all have humanity in us. And I find it hard as well. When I'm looking at people on the other political spectrum, to me, I'm like, try to understand that this is a human being just like you, even though they're saying reprehensible things that I entirely disagree with, so that's my way of trying to do that as well.
Well, you were talking at the top about, this idea of agency and deciding where you want to go. And I think there's a metaphor in the story that lines right up with what you're just saying, which is that basically like we are all trying to find our own path through the world while still being manipulated by all the forces outside of us. And so, all 4 of these sisters and also Leo and these other star soldiers are all in this position where they're making choices, but their path has been sort of predetermined for them. And in trying to, make a binary decision, go good or bad, is a lot more complicated. This is a decision that's been given to me, but is that the right decision? Is that the path that I wanted to take in the first place? And why do all roads lead to this singular decision when I should have a lot more chance to do anything but what's been put in front of me? And I think that those kinds of moral decisions, I think go to a dark place naturally because they're a really challenging thing to figure out. And if you layer in violence and magical powers and all that stuff on top of it, it's going to go dark pretty fast.
It's going to go dark. Yeah.
You came from magical realism, and most of the time, in my experience in magical realism kinds of stories, it's not super important to understand how the magic works, just that there are certain levels of rules and that the internal logic remain consistent in the story. When you get into fantasy with a capital F, proper genre, depending on where you fall in your stories, you can still kind of be in that level of like hand wavy, like it works, it's cool, as long as you dig it, it's all good. But fantasy fans can be a lot more particular about that stuff, about how it works. You've got an elemental magic here, but there's lots of layers of things going on here. So how did you approach the development of that magic? And at any point, did you find that you wrote yourself into a corner where you're like, oh, I gave too much power here, or not enough power here, or the rules don't work in this and I have to rework them? Like, how did that happen within your storytelling process?
Yeah, I was completely out of my depth. I mean, when I started this, because I'm a reader who doesn't really care about consistency. I mean, unless you give me some glaring plot hole. But if I'm enjoying the story, I'm not questioning it. I'm just going with it and I'm enjoying it. But then I was told by my agent, no, fantasy fans really know their stuff. And if you try and put something past them, they're gonna call you on it. And I was like, oh my God. I wasn't aware of how much I had to make the rules for. That how much, that it wouldn't work here or it wouldn't work there because of this reason or that reason. I thought, I just wrote this story and it works from a story point of view. But it probably took us almost as much time towards the end of drafting to make sure that everything made sense and that everything could be explained and that there were no loopholes and that there were no little things that fell out. And it probably went through like 3 editors, 6 copy editors, and still right at the last minute, we found like some tiny thing that because the mother had died, the sister couldn't have, and how did they get into Everwhere? That was a big thing for me. It was like, to me, I just thought, oh, well, they dream themselves there and they walk through the gates. But then how do the soldiers get there? They only can go on a certain day, whereas the sisters can go at any time. And how do the mothers get there? It just became this huge nightmare of trying to make everything work. But I guess it was good for me. It was a good lesson. It was a good doing my maths, taking my medicine. Now I feel, I'm a much stronger writer because of it. I'm less sort of wishy-washy, because you're right, with magical realism, you're like, yeah, just a little sprinkle, a little magic here and there. And it's kind of cute, but it doesn't have to, hold up. It doesn't have a certain rigor to it in the way that fantasy writing does.
I think also the length of a work affects that, because in short stories or novella or shorter novels, like just it's easier to track over time. But I think it's also just easier to be forgiven for playing a little fast and loose. But once you hit that 400 and 500 or 600 pages in a novel, people are there invested long enough. They need things to make sense. And yeah, so suddenly you've got a little more pressure on you to handle those things.
It's true. And this is twice as long as any book I've ever written. So this was a huge thing for me. If I think about all the drafts and all the cutting, it will have been twice as long again. So it was, this whole thing of fantasy and you have these big doorstopper books. I was like, oh my goodness. Again, if I'd have known this going in, I wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, but you have a beautiful product on the other side, so...
No, I'm proud of it. I'm really proud of
it. You mentioned that it sounds like you're a discovery writer or a pantser, and you mentioned that you are working in Word docs and note cards. Do you have any kind of plotting system that you're kind of paying attention to?
No. I think I would be better if I did. But then the biggest joy that I get from writing is writing a scene and being surprised by it. So on the other hand, it would give me a lot less heartache to be one of those writers who plots and they know exactly what scene's going to happen and where it's all leading to. For me, I always only know the very beginning and the very end. And if that excites me enough to want to know how that arc happens, then I'll just go on that journey. And like I say, I'll be writing to find out for myself where I'm going and what's going to happen. And essentially, at some point, the story dictates to me where it should be going. Obviously, then we have to go and make it all make sense at the end. But it's so exciting to be writing something and then have the character say something you completely didn't expect. And then the scene goes in a totally different way than you'd realized. And you don't know. And it's just this most incredible joy because you're feeling like something's being channeled through you and you're taking notes. And that's wonderful.
I'd imagine that when you're getting the daily epiphany, essentially, when something works its way out, those are the satisfying moments when your brain locks a couple of things in place and you're sitting there and it solves problems for you. Almost feels like it's not you doing it. It's your brain doing it, but it's a background process that is suddenly coming to fruition.
Yeah, it's like your car is on automatic and it's taking you exciting places. And those great moments pretty much make up for the banging your head against the desk because you just can't you can't like connect with that and it's just not working. And you wish that you plotted things out so that you made it more simple for yourself.
Is it kind of like, I can't speak to this from experience, but people will talk about how childbirth is a thing that after a little while afterwards, you don't remember the pain and discomfort and trouble of it. You just remember the miracle of birth. I was writing a novel the same way where you feel like long enough away from it, you'll remember the joys and maybe less the hardships.
Maybe, but I'm not one of those women. I can remember that pain. It was pretty horrendous. And maybe in like 20 more years, maybe it'll be like this hazy thing and I'll just be, oh yeah, that was a beautiful miracle. But it was a beautiful miracle, but it was also a hideous 26 hours of labor. So the book at the end, beautiful miracle, but I still remember the labor. I really do.
It's good to maintain perspective. And I think I would be remiss without mentioning that, we are recording this during pandemic lockdowns and sort of a worldwide concern over the COVID-19 thing. How has that been affecting both your promotion of this book, your life in general, and whatever you're working on now?
Well, promotion-wise, it's been really sad because everything's been cancelled. So I was lined up to do a bunch of things in England, including Comic-Con in London, which I was super excited about. I was like, Comic-Con, this was such a huge thing. Like I probably had fantasies, not that I've written characters like this, but I've had people doing cosplay, coming up to me dressed as my characters. That would be an ultimate joy. So I was very sad when that got cancelled. But obviously, have to put everything in perspective because it's horrendous. And it's like being in a science fiction film, quite apart from all of the tragedy, which is just awful. And we, feel for people so keenly. My own mom is compromised, so she's been isolating for a lot longer than everyone else. And we're scared for her. We're scared for everyone. And going to the supermarket, everyone's wearing masks, got to stay 2 meters away. They have all these playgrounds in Cambridge that have been chained up. And we have to stand in line and everything's separated. And there's all these hazard lines in the supermarket. There's nothing on the supermarket shelves. I just keep feeling like I'm in an episode of some horrendous, it doesn't feel quite real. It creates an agitation as well because we're all feeling it. And I can't read right now.
I have a similar trouble. Yeah, it's tough.
It's like you can't kind of switch off because reading to me takes a certain amount of relaxation. It is it's almost like a meditation. I think that's a real shame. And obviously the bookshops are closed and bookshops are my favorite thing in the world. Bookshops and cafes are my favorite thing in the world. So I'm having to get used to, I never buy books online, but my 2 local bookstores are online. So I'm kind of like having to work it out. It's just not the same. I love to go into a store and see what's there. And of course, it's sad for me personally because I'm not seeing my book in the bookstores. Right.
That's one of the great joys, right? To go see it on the shelf.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So before it all happened, so I do, I feel for all authors and we see all each other on Twitter going, oh, my book's out right now. Little wave.
Everybody's doing virtual book tours because nobody can leave their house. And oh yeah, that stuff is tough. And I had a friend who tweeted yesterday. She was like, does anybody else feel like their main hobby was going out to eat? When you're suddenly deprived of the ability to do it, or like you said, to go hang out in a cafe, to just go sit in a shop somewhere. And any of those things right now are gone. And you're like, you don't really think about how much of your life revolved, at least for us that like to get out of the house or a little more extroverted, like to be around people or whatever it is, like to be in the energy of people moving around. I mean, I would go to my bookstore every week, even if I wasn't buying anything, because like, I mean, as a book reviewer, people send me books all the time, and then I go buy more books. And then there's just more all the time. My wife thinks I'm crazy. I mean, she understands my obsession, but she also knows that I'm nuts because I'm constantly just getting more that I can keep up with. And then right now, like you said, it's kind of tough to read. And sometimes people will be like, oh, the new dystopian book. I'm like, I don't know. We're living in dystopian. I can't even imagine reading that kind of thing. I don't need a pandemic novel. I'm already so anxious, you know?
But this is so weird to me that these are the bestsellers right now. Like Albert Camus, The Plague is number one. And I'm like, I don't want to read about that. I'm living in that. Every time I go outside, every time I turn on the news, you know, it's surreal. It's so strange. I want to read, you know, nice, fluffy things. Like we're watching MasterChef right now. I watch cooking shows. Cooking shows is how I relax. And I need to, like at bedtime, I have to watch a cooking show in order to sleep.
I feel frustrated that I'd already gotten through all of Great British Bake Off. Because we end up watching a lot of like on YouTube, there's like Bon Appetit and all these other like cooking, just like shorter form things, like 15 minutes or whatever. And so my wife and I end up watching a lot of those. But it might be a time for a rewatch of the baking show because like I need that chill back in my life.
So true. It's so true. And I found like I tried to watch American versions, but I find that you guys always hype up the drama.
Oh, it's crap. It's total crap.
And the tension.
Yeah.
You know, I watch like American cooking shows and it's like, it's a competition. Who's going to win? Who's going to not? You know, and I was like, I'm very stressed right now. What I love about the Bake Off is it's just about cake and nothing, you know, it's so relaxed. These are the stakes. The stakes are you going to have a soggy bottom or is your cake going to rise? You know?
Is it going to be worth the calories, you know?
Exactly. These are the kind of stakes that we need right now to kind of fool ourselves into thinking that everything's fine.
Yeah, except for you can't get the Paul Hollywood handshake. You've got to stay 6 feet apart from it. So
I find it weird now watching things and seeing all the hugging. And my brother said, do you think we're going to date things from, it's like when you watch a film and it has a very old mobile phone on it, a cell phone, and you realize, hey, that is really old. And now I'm watching MasterChef and they're all hugging and they're all sharing food. You know, they're both eating cakes and stuff. Yeah. And you're like, no, don't do
What are you doing? No. Yeah, it will be interesting to see who we all come out as on the other side of this, depending on how long. I already feel like a shift in habits and the things that we do things at home that I think will probably be a little more baked in whatever normalcy looks like on the other side, if we return to something that looks the same as it did before. But I feel like we're all going to have some things that are definitely shifted, hopefully for the positive and hopefully in healthy ways. But, you know, you never know with these things. So we'll see how we come out the other side. On the more positive end of things, the Sisters Grimm is available now. And people can have it, and they can escape into a magical and dark and twisty and not at all pandemic-related world.
No pandemics in the Sisters Grimm. No. It really is like self-empowerment, self-realization. Yeah, I think it'll make you feel better.
Yeah. So like I said, Sisters Grimm is available now. It's out from Harper Voyager. Here in the States, it is in this just absolutely beautiful hardcover with just gorgeous artwork. I'm not sure if it looks the same in the UK. There's usually a different kind of cover. But it's lovely, and once it's back on shelves, I think it's going to be catching people's eyes because it's awesome. Hopefully people will be finding it online and checking this stuff out. In the meantime, where should people be following you online so they can keep up with your work and know what's coming up next, and also to find your back catalog?
I'm mostly on Instagram, so just Menna.van Praag, and I just post lots of bookish pictures. I have a big office. I'm like you. I have so many books. I have too many books, and I keep buying more books. And my husband's like, "Why are all what?" And then he'll see editions of the same book. But you know, because when I love a book, I have to have the multiple editions, and then maybe they'll bring out a special edition, and then I need to have the special edition. You know, so yeah, there are way too many books, and I take pictures of them, and it makes me happy and brings me comfort.
Well, that is absolutely wonderful. I know you're on Twitter. What's your website?
Just mennavanpraag.com.
It's nice when you have a fairly uncommon name, right?
Yeah.
Helps out as an author.
It's not taken already. So.
Right. Well, Menna, thank you so much. This has been super fun. People should check out The Sisters Grimm. I think it's a good book to dive into in these dark and curious times. as an escape from the rest of the world and an exploration of agency. Thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Season 5, Episode 5 of Fictitious. If you're new to the program, Fictitious has a big backlog of author interviews to keep you entertained and writing during pandemic lockdown. Listen and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or search for the show using your favorite podcasting app. Or you can find every episode at fictitiouspodcast.com. If you'd like to help support my work with Fictitious, there are 2 ways to do so, either by becoming a monthly supporter on Patreon or through donations using Ko-Fi. Patreon subscribers will receive patron-exclusive content, including video blogs and mini podcasts. Accompanying this episode is an additional chat with Menna van Praag, where she talks about her favorite writing books and the fictional world she'd love to cross over with her characters. It's available only to Patreon supporters. To join, go to fictitiouspodcast.com/Patreon. You can also make a one-time donation using Ko-Fi. It's fast and easy and very much appreciated. Go to fictitiouspodcast.com/Ko-Fi to get started. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it on your social profiles, tell all your book-loving friends, or write a review. All of that supports the authors who appear on the program and helps me to grow the podcast. My next interview arrives in about a week. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.